Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome back to the Apex Magazine Snap Judgment live stream. It's been a minute. We have had a little bit of a break in our schedule, and we're back on track in 2025. It's very exciting to be back. Thank you all for being here, for tuning in, and for continuing your ongoing support of Apex Magazine. We're so excited to get back into the stream with Snap Judgment today. So, as a reminder, here is how it works. Our subscribers and patrons for Apex Magazine have submitted the first page of their genre short stories or novels or novellas, as the case might be sometimes. The first page up to 250 words. I will be reading the submissions out loud. And if at any point anyone in our panel of editors and judges feels they would stop reading if they had come across this piece in the slush pile, they will raise their hand. Once all three hands get raised, I stop reading and our editors give their feedback. The judges' critiques here today are meant to help you hone your craft and to answer that age-old question of what is a magazine editor really looking for? And hopefully we can shed some insight on all of that today. We do receive a lot more stories than we can cover in the 90 minutes that the stream entails, so your entries have been randomized, and we will go in the order that fate has set. We do apologize in advance, of course, if we don't get to your work. Please join me in welcoming our judges today. Lesley Conner is Apex Magazine's editor-in-chief and author of the alternate history extreme horror novel, The Weight of Chains. Welcome, Lesley.
Hi.
We have Rebecca E. Treasure, managing editor and flash editor of Apex Magazine, a writer with short fiction in Galaxy's Edge, Air and Nothingness Press, and many others. Welcome, Becky. And our very exciting, very special guest, Sloane Leong, author of indigenous sci-fi series Prism Stalker, co-editor of the award-winning Death in the Mouth anthology series, and narrative game designer at Wizards of the Coast. Sloane, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Clearly, we are so excited to have you here. We were so excited to have you here that we were able to put ourselves on hold and wait, and the time is finally right, and we're so grateful that you could
All
be here with us
here.
today.
Thank you.
Yes. Everyone, my name is Allie Grauer. I'm your host and narrator. Ghost lighting, moonlighting, guest lighting with with the Apex Magazine Snap Judgment team here. Um, and I am excited to get started. I think we should just dive right in. What do you guys think?
Let's do it.
All right, here we go. Pulling up our first submission. Okay, our first piece is a dark fantasy short story titled The Memory Eaters. The eaters come at midnight, dressed in children's bodies, their faces hidden behind pale clay masks. A mass of small bodies drags Roshan down, crushes the breath from his chest. Tongues dart from the holes in the masks, lick his skin, slurp at the tattoos on his arms, fill his skull with burning agony. They devour Roshan's memories of his family, leaving only ghosts in his head. He curls into a fetal ball and does not watch them depart. Hours later, as he trudges over the desert sand, his limbs feel strangely light. The tattoos were crisp and dark before the eaters feasted, heavy as iron chains. Now they are gray and weightless as the pre-dawn sky, their lines smudged into illegibility. The memories that people can become through magic are not like natural memories. They are alive. They can converse with the one who carries them. They can be conjured back into the world, and they can die. The strangest thing, Roshan thinks, is that he can still remember his life before last night. He can picture the cave where he spent his childhood, can recall the years he dwelt there, but the family who lived with him, the family who trusted him as their strongest kinsman to carry them safely across the desert, have become a faceless blur. Off to a really good start here. No hands raised. Interesting. I would like to start, if I may, with Rebecca, because I saw you get comfortable.
Me first. Um, that opening is spectacular and earns a lot of trust and investment from me because the eaters come at midnight dressed in children's bodies. I am so all in with that. Um, I think I did a lot of note taking, but I think I would definitely keep reading. This is a great opening. I'm very invested. That what is it? The paragraph of exposition a bit of the ways down did throw off the immersion for me a little bit. And it wasn't the exposition or the grounding that I was looking for. I feel like I kind of understood what was happening with the memories. What I wanted to know is who Roshan was and where we were.
Mm.
And so the time and place and the character for me were a little dislocated, but I was so invested in what was happening and the obvious skill of the language and the richness of this crazy body horror thing where they're licking his skin and like I would definitely have kept reading.
Yeah, awesome. Lesley?
I agree. I love that first line. I am a little bit confused because you say dressed in children's bodies and then clay mask. Is it a combination of actual children's bodies and a clay mask because maybe you can't fit the head over? Or is it a clay child suit? I would like to know that because when you say dressed in kids' bodies, children's bodies, I'm imagining a flesh body, and then you said clay. So that is something that I would like to clarify. I would definitely keep reading from this point. My only kind of like hesitation is I feel like this opening sets up super high expectations. And I feel like it sets the expectations so high that if there is a weak spot in this story, it's going to feel like a letdown. Um, so it's just like those expectations are really built up. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying it's something to be conscious of when you set those expectations. If you're like, oh my gosh, this is so stellar, you need to make sure that that follows through because there is nothing worse than reading a story, loving it, loving it, loving it, loving it, and then the ending doesn't land, and you just feel really let down as a reader and as an editor. So I would just make sure that this story doesn't fall to that kind of like trip up where people are so like, you got to hook the reader, you have to hook the reader, work on the beginning. Don't don't let that mean that you ignore the ending as well because it's just as important. I think that the rest of I do want more grounding on like where we are. I was a little bit caught off guard by sand because I my expectations, like you say, they come at midnight. I'm imagining them in a street, right? And then I'm like, oh wait, no, that's not where we are at all. But you have plenty of time to build that up. Um, but I think it's really good. I really enjoyed it. I absolutely love that opening. I just want there to be clarification and I want to make sure that the high expectations you're setting for the story continue, that follows all the way through and that you don't stumble somewhere and let the reader down.
Yeah, I think that's a good warning. Definitely. We hear, I mean, that's why snap judgment is set with the opening pages, the opening paragraphs, is it's so important to bring the reader into the story and give them that promise that you're going to deliver. But you got a point, Lesley. Make sure you deliver.
Yeah, that I can tell you there have been stories that I've read in the slush that I am like 100% I am buying this story. And then you get to the end and you're like, oh, no, I'm not buying this story because it fizzles. And this wonderful setup has just gone nowhere. So I do get a little concerned when I'm like, oh, wonderful setup. And I'm like, oh, please let it go all the way through.
Yeah, important to keep in mind in editing and rewrites. Sloane, what you got?
Yeah, I mean, I would echo both Leslie and Rebecca on all their points. I also thought this was a very strong opening. I agree that I feel like there could be a little bit more specificity of place nested into these opening lines, like the eaters come at midnight across the desert, just immediately set the scene. of like where this character is. Um, what else? I found it curious that this character, there's no mention of him struggling against these eaters. Sounds like he's either my first impression was that he was maybe immobilized because it sounds like he's not putting up a fight, he's not running. But then he curls into a fetal ball and kind of just lays there. So I'm like, why did he let that happen? Or what is the
Mm.
deal there? Those are some questions that kind of popped into my head. But yeah, I love kind of like the speculative element we're getting here. The memories are gone. It's affecting his tattoos, which is pretty cool. A physical element of this character. I wasn't crazy about, I think it's the like fifth little paragraph that was kind of like explaining what these special memories are. I think that's something that could have been probably maybe shown later in action
Mm.
rather than just like memories. These are special like magic memories and they can be conjured into the world and da, 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 da. I'm like, okay,
Hmm.
I don't care about that. I care about the vibes that you're building right now. I don't necessarily care about like the details at this moment. Um, but everything else I thought was pretty cool. I really like this idea that there's like elements that these eaters are consuming and taking away from this character. And yeah, I'd be curious to see why they're in this world, how they function in this world, and overall what it says about this character and just like the general condition of his of like who he is. So yeah, pretty cool.
Yeah. Really, really interesting opening. A lot of texture.
Hmm.
Let's move on to our next entry here. This is a dark fantasy short story called Call Waiting. The phone doesn't ring for everyone, I say over my shoulder as I lead the next client through the maze of shadowy rooms and hallways. The aging floorboards protest each of our steps with an unnerving croak, but the warped ridges and valleys in the hardwood are a well-worn path under my socks. The client follows so closely that her breaths come in hitched little gasps mere inches from the back of my neck, and she catches my heels twice. But she never apologizes. She doesn't even seem to notice. My rate is by the minute, and you have up to 6 hours. I continue, stopping outside my father's office. I step to the side before the client can crash into me. After that, your luck is up. Better to try again another day. The door lets out a deep guttural groan as I push it open, and I lean back so I don't accidentally step over the threshold. Is that it? She whispers, nodding at the antique rotary receiver sitting alone on Dad's executive desk. A single ray of late afternoon sunlight slips through the faded curtains directly behind, casting a long golden stripe across the phone's brass base. No refunds if it doesn't ring. This bit comes out more forceful than I meant, and an uncomfortable heat creeps into my ears. Be patient, though. Most people have to wait a while before. Second entry, no hands. And a deliberate cliffhanger that they gave us here. Lesley, what do you think?
I was on the verge of raising my hand because we've got 250 words and we're really have no idea yet what the story is. We have a lot of description of sounds of the house, which makes, or the building. We don't even know for sure that it's a house. We have a lot of description from sounds of that, which makes me feel like the house is part, like almost a character in itself, but I'm not sure about that. We don't know who this person is, like why do they want to hear this phone ring? We don't know what the phone does. We don't know who the person taking them back to the room where the phone is. We really don't have any grounding of what that is yet. So if that next line, I'm assuming like there was a dash there at the end, I'm assuming that means that the phone immediately rings when this person goes in and your story is actually getting started. If it's not, something would have to start moving pretty quickly for me to keep reading because I feel like we're getting a lot of very nicely written description, but it's not description that actually is adding to the story and adding to the plot. Like I have no mooring right now on what is actually happening and what I should expect from this story. So I would hope that that next line is where this really jumps off and takes running.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if we got that big dash in there. I'm hoping. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping that it's like the phone immediately rings when this person steps over that line, and then we really get grounded in what the actual story is, because
Mhm.
as of right now,
Not sure.
I have
Yeah.
no idea. Like, I don't want a telephone to ring at my house. So like, why does this person want a phone to ring? So like,
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Sloane, what do you think?
Yeah, I thought this was a like solid opening. Definitely agree with Lesley. I think there could be a lot of little details cut and maybe more focus on probably some interiority. Like we're in this character's head. I would be curious to know a little bit more about this character's thoughts on this client. It's an easy way to seed in more setup about what the speculative element is with the phone. Um, like their perspective on people who use this phone. I'm assuming they're gonna be in contact with maybe like someone who's dead or some other fantastical element.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think one thing, even with the last piece, um, interiority is really important to me because I feel like that is the heart of a story a lot of the time. Um, and I find a lot of writers where will kind of try and do a shortcut by just noting either like the physical elements of the body and how they're reacting instead of actually trying to describe the very difficult kind of amorphous uh, state of like their feelings and thoughts and trying to parse those out. So I think that could add a lot to this opening and story in general, I think.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah. Becky?
Yeah. Um, I think this is a really effective opening in a lot of ways. I was kind of like, oh, it's just describing the setting, but then that word socks was kind of surprising because when you're dealing with a client and aging floorboards, you're kind of expecting a more formal attire. So having socks in there, I was like, okay, that's an interesting, a disturbance of what we would expect. Um, but then we go back to some more just kind of generic descriptions, and there's not a lot of, like Sloan was saying, interiority. And there's not, like Lesley was saying, there's not a lot of concrete description or, showing us what's actually going on with this. And that can be effective because it does cause the reader to some questions, right? But the danger is that if you go on too long without giving the reader answers, as they start to draw their own conclusions, because that's just how human brains work. And then if the reader is wrong about the conclusions, like Sloan said, and this was my assumption as well, is that we're waiting for the dead to call. If it's not the dead and it's something, jarring, then the reader is the purpose of an opening of a story is to sort of hypnotize the reader and bring them into our world. And if we jar them out of it, then we have to start that whole process over again. And so trying to be as smooth as possible in immersing them in the setting and the story and the character. Um, and that's risky if you're not giving them a lot of concrete details. The last thing that I wanted to say is just kind of like what Sloan was saying about interiority. We're told over and over and over and over again, show, don't tell, show, don't tell. But some things have to be told in order for the showing to have meaning. Like if you tell
Mm,
me that your character sighs or their heart is racing, hey, I sigh for lots of reasons and my heart races for lots of reasons. And if you don't contextualize that physicality, then it's meaningless. So you need to pair it with that interiority in some way so that these physical descriptions have meaning to the reader. But I would
that's
have kept reading, looking for very quickly to be oriented.
I really love how you said that, Rebecca, about if you don't answer a reader's questions in the right time, they draw their own conclusions, and then it can be very jarring for the reader to experience your answer to that question if it's not delivered in a timely manner. And I think that that must change piece to piece, probably, and even genre to genre. But that's such a good way to think about it that I hadn't thought about it before. Yeah, I loved the texture of this piece and I really wanted to know what was going on. But it is interesting that you said the assumption was potentially like the dead might be calling or they're contacting someone, they're waiting to be contacted by someone who might be dead. That was also my first thought, and I think that's very interesting. Um,
Well, I mean, I think the other media has fed us that line before. Like there's very popular shows and stories and movies that use that. Like The Black Phone is the dead's calling the kid in the basement. Um, so yeah, I do think you have to be aware when you're using something like that, like what other cultural context
yeah.
is there? And I'm gonna mute
Is
before.
yeah, yeah. But what you're saying is there already a precedent for this idea? And if you're doing something new with it, bring that piece of newness earlier so that we know that it's going to be different, but even if we don't know how yet. That's cool. Really cool. Third entry is a dark fantasy short story titled Burning Bright. You come to the sanctum with a sense of security, more an indifferent spectator than an anxious participant. People flock together when the light dims and the sentience's power wanes. There is strength in numbers, immunity within a crowd, but nothing is as powerful as a sacrifice. You're not worried. You have been named, cast out into the cruel night, and survived. It wasn't by the virtue of your skills, your magic, or the grace of the sentience. I let you go because you weren't ready then. Your misplaced confidence will cost you. It numbs you to the telltale signs, oblique glances from the crowd, faint shadows looking at your heels, a twinge of foreboding in your heart. I've waited long enough. Each night, people gather in the sanctum. They watch the light wane and bathe in my sister's last rays. Her reddish gleam on their faces is too low to hold a trace of warmth, too dim to evoke compassion. Once she's dipped behind the horizon, I'll claim you. The crowd huddles together, bodies pressing close, moving in unity. It's a strange dance of anticipation and apprehension. Spell-woven charms loop around necks, wrists, and fingers. Many have painted their bare skin with intricate patterns of trusted warding symbols. You stand apart, neither dread nor pity in your heart, only distance. All you carry is a torch, a knife, and the knowledge that neither trinket nor painted symbol changes fate. I like how it strengthens your spirit and ripens your magic. All right, let's start with Sloane.
I think at the beginning I was like, "Ooh, these are a lot of special in-story terminology," and I was getting a little hesitant. I was like, I don't know if this is gonna work. But this first person perspective, I think, kind of pulled me back in. I like the conversation that this narrator is having with this other character, or at least on their side. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So I don't know. I like this. There is not a lot of hand-holding, I think. It's kind of dumping you right into the scene. It's
Mhm.
dumping you into a relationship dynamic. And that got my curiosity going. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely a tricky POV to nail,
Mm-hmm.
certainly. But yeah, there's something really interesting about wondering why, right? And where it's going to take us.
Yeah, for sure.
Rebecca.
Yeah, I like this. I love second person when it's done really effectively. And I like fantasy and high fantasy and secondary world type fantasy, which is what this is reading to me as. Um, but again, I would be looking very quickly for some sense of either the you character or the I character. Like the I character, we get a little bit. I'm assuming it's the moon in some way, or some kind of night deity. But I'm a little dislocated in the goal or like the narrative target of the piece because we know that there's some kind of sacrifice and these people are trying to protect against it, then why are they there? If they don't want to be chosen, then why are they, gathering in the sanctum? There's a lot of questions being brought up by this that aren't answered. Now, in 250 words, that's really hard to do, especially when you have this kind of rich emotional environment that you're crafting. This like Sloane was saying, the relationship between the I and the you character here is really palpable. So I would definitely keep reading, but again, I would be looking very quickly to have just a brief, concrete understanding of, even if not like the story goal, then a scene goal. Like, what are we doing? Where are we going with this? Do we want to be chosen? Do we not? What does that mean for the character?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Lesley, what do you think?
Well, secondary world fantasy is not my my jam, so I am a little bit I'm not as into this. I am confused, like, because we have a break in it where it almost feels like the scene starts over, and I'm still not sure if the perspective from the opening, like the very beginning, and then perspective from where it feels like it starts over, if the eyes are the same person, or are we in a different perspective? And I'm really unsure of that at this point, because it's like I've waited a lot, waited long enough. Then there's a break, and then it starts over talking about how each night people gather at the sanctum, which is where we started in the very beginning. And so
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's the same perspective or not. This type of fantasy isn't my favorite, so I probably would tap out just simply because it's not my thing. Like that would be like if I felt like the story was strong, but I just wasn't clicking with it, that's when I would be sending it to Becky going, "Hey, Becky, I need your opinion on this because I know it's not my thing, but I know it is your thing." So yeah, other than that really big confusion about whether the narrating character is the same in that first chunk and in the second, because that needs to be clear. Like, there's nothing more disorienting than not knowing
Who's talking?
Who's talking.
Yeah.
Who am I? Who is the I in this situation? And if it's not the same, why? Like, because that seems like in novels, yeah, that happens all the time, but you usually have some sort of indicator, other than in Train Spotting, there's no indicator, but you usually have some sort of indicator what character is the narrating character at that point. In a short story, that's harder. And so I would really, really kind of take a look at, like, why would you, if that's what's happening, why is that the choice that you made? Because there are other ways to make it less tedious on your readers.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I feel like this is the type of introduction to a story that feels um like, I hesitate to use the word cinematic, but it feels kind of cinematic, right? Like we're descending into the story from somewhere and learning as we get closer to the zoom to find the protagonist or whatever. And I'm curious. I want to know I want to know who the I is, right? I want to know what the yeah. We're seeing pieces of it, that the light is red and it's very dim and it's distant, and it that there's some kind of ritual or sacrifice about to take place, but I don't have any idea what kind of time period analog we have. I don't know what it feels like, how they're dressed. I'm curious, but I'm not getting any of that from how cinematically we're zooming in. Does that make sense?
Hmm.
All right. Anything else, or should we head on forward? Party on.
Sorry.
Oh yeah,
I
go
was too
ahead.
slow to unmute. I was leaning forward. I just wanted to say, second person is an amazing POV, and I'm a big fan, especially as a reader. I love, but if we're gonna, and I'm not seeing it in this, which is why I'm bringing it up about this excerpt. If you're gonna choose second person, like any POV. Just make sure it's an intentional choice and it's not just like a vibey choice, or if it is, I'm all about vibes. If it is a vibey choice, justify it somehow in the story.
Hmm.
Because it can be a tricky one for editors to read and for an audience to read, because you're putting the character, the reader as the character, and it can feel artificial if it's not intentionally done.
Yeah,
So
because
it's
if you
just one to make sure that
Yeah.
you're careful if you use second person.
like
So
as a reader, if you have a moment of going, I wouldn't do that, like that yanks you out of the story when they're telling you you're doing this and you're going, no, I'm not. Like, so you
which
have
can
to
be the point. That jarring experience as the you can be the point. But
Yeah.
again, like make sure you're doing that intentionally, not accidentally.
right, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super important for sure.
I was gonna say also, just to add on to for first person and second person, it's a really great perspective for really showing your character's impulses and how everything they notice is shaped around their desires and their whatever is motivating them to pursue things. So it's a
Mm.
really great way also for details to get lost, because things that they are not concerned about or on the periphery of their desire are not going to be noticed by this character. They're not going to have like an all-encompassing view of the story. So that's another way, like you can think, how can that limitation of this character's perspective be used usefully in the story?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. How does that limitation create the reader experience, and how can you use it in a useful way to what you're trying to accomplish? That's great. All right, awesome. We have a horror short story, The Whale Pavilion. Max didn't notice the camper van at first. He was too busy staring down the ominous road sign, pitched into the off-route branching from the highway. The sign was added, it seemed, not by whomever placed yields and the next town is blank kilometers away signs, but by someone else, a thin campground strip of pine rather than yellow metal. A carving like image of a moose roamed at the top of the sign. Its eyes were painted black. Max thought it grim, unsure who would place such a thing, let alone across from the whale pavilion. He read and reread the bottom almost unconsciously. Accidents 2024, 1. Total accidents, 13. Max licked his ice cream, a swirl soft serve, in cyclone circles to beat the melting pace. It bothered him to watch the chocolate and vanilla merge into one color, the spiral rounding out to a dirty snow pile lump, but it bothered him more to drip. The bay lapped behind him. The day was windless, and though Max didn't bother to look, he imagined an old water wheel akin to off-route towns on the other side of the outhouses. The churning spread across the water, and there was no logical spot on the semi-steep rock shelf for a water wheel, but he liked to picture it in his mind, to take his focus off the 13 total accidents and the soulless moose head stooping beside them. Interesting. Rebecca?
I love this. It's very uncanny, and it raises a question in the character's mind at the same time that it's in, introducing that question in the reader's mind. Um, I like the concrete description of Max's experience with his ice cream. Um, Even though it's a familiar experience, I think it's well executed there. Um, I don't, I'm not sure what a whale pavilion is. And since that's the title, that's a question that's kind of like, and questions aren't a bad thing, but that is a question that is there. And so that as a writer, it's the kind of thing where like if you raise a question in the reader's mind, be aware of that so you can either answer it or drag them on intentionally with that question. Um, I really liked the word roamed in the carving like image of a moose roamed the top of the sign. I liked melting pace. So the language here was good, and I was definitely interested in kind of the strange, unsettling vibe that was being created. So I'd keep reading.
Yeah. Lesley?
I feel like that this opening brings up a lot of questions for the reader. Like, I don't know what a whale pavilion is. I kind of love that as a title. Like, I was like, oh, that's something I've not seen before because, sometimes you see the same sort of titles over and over again. So I love that as a title, but I have no idea what that is. And we don't get any of what that is in what we have here. I also am kind of like questioning how old Max is. And I think the reason I'm questioning how old he is because my brain immediately, I'm like, this is an adult who is driven out to wherever this sign is to the whale pavilion and they're seeing this sign. But then it was like, and not that adults can't eat ice cream. I love ice cream, but like the idea of a lone adult on the side of the road eating an ice cream cone. First of all, where'd you get the ice cream? like we don't feel like I'm very unsure of what the setting is here because it's like you're on the side of the road and there's a sign and there's a whale pavilion, but we don't know what a whale pavilion is. Like, I feel like we need more world building to answer some of these questions because my brain just kept going like, well, what is that? And how old is he? And why is he so concerned with like the wheel in the water? Because there's other questions that I would like answered.
Yeah.
So I'm intrigued, but I'm hoping to get some answers at some point, like to these questions that are coming up kind of naturally as I'm reading.
Yeah, definitely. Sloane?
Yeah, I think right off the bat, there's a bit of a satirical element to this. I feel like when you're writing a horror story and then the characters immediately like noticing like weird, ominous things, like this is uncomfortable and like kind of hanging a hat on it, then I'm like, okay, maybe. And there's also like a sense of like comedy here, like in the last line, to take his focus off the 13 total accidents and the soulless moose head. So I feel like he's like a bit when the character I feel like is aware of the horror already, then I'm like, okay, this is kind of probably going to be something that's a bit more self-aware, a little bit more satirical, which is a harder sell for me personally. I don't always care necessarily for that type of story, just because I think horror comedy, satirical horror is very well trodden. um, so that kind of put me off, but I am curious. I do like some of there's kind of some like clashing details and how this character is like noticing things. Like he's looking at the sign, the bay is behind him, the pavilion is behind him, but he's imagining the bay, imagining the water wheel to try and distract himself from the sign that he's looking at. I'm just like, what is happening here? Like maybe don't look at the sign if it's bothering you. So it's a bit, yeah, it seems a bit, this character seems a bit incoherent in just this opening, but I'm curious enough that I would read a little bit further. Um, but those two elements of like the satirical, the comedy a little bit, and then a little bit of this character's like disjointed thinking, it's kind of putting me like, I don't know about this.
But I mean, that brings up something in it. Like I totally brushed past it because I got caught up in other questions. But it's going, okay, so there's 13 total accidents. In how long? You only had one accident. And what type of accident? You know what I'm saying? Like if it like if one person crashed on a road, like in the entire road, only one crash in an entire year, that's not so bad. But if it's like one murderous moose completely decimating the entire town, that's not good. So it's like right now we don't know the stakes of
Yeah, the
that
scope.
accident. And you're putting, because the character is so fixated on it, you're putting a lot of weight on those accidents without giving your reader at this point any sort of understanding of why and what that means.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things here. I think we were all really curious about in reading it. I'm wondering if the story is called Whale Pavilion, why is there a moose on the sign? And you know
There are
what I mean?
so many
I
things.
want to know. Like I would
Yeah.
read more. I would definitely read more because I want to know. And kind of like you were saying, Sloane, I want to know, is the tone going to continue to be kind of funny and quirky and like observational, or is it going to be really freaking scary? Like I'm curious. Um, a whale pavilion, according to Google, is a large shed or building of some kind that houses a whale skeleton as like a tourist visitation point. So we've all learned that today. In the chat, raise your hand if you knew what a whale pavilion was today.
Yeah, because I
Before I
didn't
said that.
know.
Yeah, I didn't know that either, but I immediately Googled it because I wanted to know. Some things we can't Google. Tell the rest of your story, please. I want to know. But yeah, this is a lot of really good points. And a curious setting for a curious situation. Our next is also a horror short story. This one is called One Last Trip Past the Devil's Teeth. I always hated being alone, but that's what I am, alone and adrift. My love no longer voyages beside me. When the cancer left of her body, what the cancer left of her body was boxed up like leftovers and dropped into a hole. She's stuck there. I wish I hadn't done that to her. The lapping of the sea against our boat marks an unsteady rhythm. My ears keep trying to find music in it, but no patterns ever form, just meaningless noise. The evening sun slips further, painting a few feeble clouds in shades of pink and orange. Behind me, the Farallon Islands rise out of the water into threatening rocky points, bright red, the feasting maw of a monster. They're known as the Devil's Teeth. In the distance beyond them, the Golden Gate Bridge and San Francisco skyline glisten like 1,000 watching eyes. She loved it out here. So did I, but it's not the same without her. I turned off our cabin cruiser's engines hours ago. I'm tired of the noise, tired of being pushed onward, ever onward. That's existence, I guess, but the adventure is gone. It's a cruel thing to be victimized by a gap in time. Time. There wasn't enough before, and now there's too much. The chaotic drumming of the water is muted by the shush of a passing breeze. An ominous quiet follows. One of those strange moments where nature's heart stops. An ethereal voice rings out and breaks the silence. There is no joy left in your journey. Okay, so we had Sloane's hand up maybe halfway through this piece. Leslie's came a little bit after that. Becky did not raise her hand. Becky, take us away.
It was close though, because I feel like almost like a broken record sometimes when we do these, because there's similar concerns, but I don't have any sense of this character except that their loved one died of cancer and that they're in San Francisco on a boat. And that makes it difficult for me to invest, but it also makes it difficult for me to extrapolate or imagine, to start to like put myself in their position to get into that hypnotic state that stories aim for. And so my first thought was like, I have no idea who's speaking, but they give us a little bit with the boat and the Golden Gate Bridge and the San Francisco skyline. So do I, but it's not the same without her. But it's a lot of this character exploring one note, one emotion of this loneliness, this grief, this sadness, without giving us anything else to hang our hats on, any kind of goal, any kind of like sense of the speculative until that very, very end. Before that, it could just be a literary piece about, you know, a loved one dying. And so again, without that grounding, without that sense of a goal or motivation in the character, I was very close to raising my hand. But I did like the the distance that the character has to this environment, which is it does feel reminiscent of grief to me. And so I felt like that made sense to me. And so I was willing to give it, you know, more time.
Okay. Lesley? Muted.
I was too busy writing down notes. I forgot had muted myself. I nothing is happening in what we have here. You the just keeps telling us how alone they are and how sad that they're alone and that they have to keep going on this voyage. Which is confusing to me because like we're not in the middle of the ocean. We're right by the Golden Gate Bridge. Like so if you're on this like long voyage and you're talking about this is a voyage where you went with your love, like she loved it out here. That isn't like you say voyage, I'm thinking like an epic scope. And this doesn't, once you tell me that we're right there, like that doesn't feel epic to me. And so immediately I was like, I don't understand what you mean by voyage. And it really, I just kind of like at a certain point, I want to be like, yeah, I get it. You're alone. You don't like being alone. So get off the boat. Like it just got to the point where I was starting to get annoyed with the narrator most. I will say I loved the line about boxing her up like leftovers and dropping her in a hole in the ground. That was perfect. Like I was like, yes, because that felt like that was an image I could sink my teeth into. And other than when you're describing where like being on the water by the Golden Gate Bridge, those are the only two times you're giving us something that really you can sink your teeth into and feel like you have something that could be a story. The rest of it just feels very vague, and kind of whiny, and I just wanted to be like, okay, I get it, you're sad, great, but your story has to be more than just somebody telling us they're sad, because you're not even making me feel sad, right? Like if you're going to have a story that's about grief, then you need to write it in such a way to where your reader isn't being told this story is about grief. They're feeling the grief with the character. And I'm not getting that from this at all.
It's a really good point. Sloane.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like there's lots of mentions of the wife, but it's not necessarily about missing her. It's about this character hating being alone. And it's kind of this
Mm.
like self-centered, kind of like self-pitying perspective that I actually kind of liked. I kind of like that we didn't sink into just like, you know, grief. It's just like it's an interesting but like kind of like a negative trait that you would see in a character, but I think that's kind of like a bold choice to have like a character that is not immediately likable like that. I was like, wow, you just kind of care about yourself and that you can't enjoy yourself now because she's gone and you're not necessarily like maybe you'll get someone else and that will be fine and you won't miss your wife or whatever like um but besides that, I just felt like, again, like Leslie said, like this felt very vague. I was not getting a lot of like emotional depth from this, and not a lot of like story action. I felt like the language was just a little bit plain, which can be fine, but in this opening section, I was just like, kind of glossing over this language. There was not really anything giving me much substance. It was just very like delivering some basic details of what this character is doing. So like I got a little bit bored. Um, but yeah, I would be curious to see like if this character continues to go down this like route of like kind of focusing on themselves and their own plight. I think that would be interesting. But yeah, I kind of bowed out in the middle of this.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that that's also a really good point. It being a bold choice to have them start in this state of kind of self-pitying, um, makes you hope certainly that there's going to be some sort of transformation or change, in the story. I wanted to know if the journey has no meaning and there's no joy and not even the water or the beautiful sunset and the view of the Golden Gate Bridge, none of this has any meaning. Very Hamlet of you. That I want to know why this person came out here at all. If there's no point to any of it, why are we here? And if there is a point to that, like one last, like the title indicates, one last trip, like to accomplish what, I want to know that sooner. Because if there's anything at stake, I want to know about it.
Well, we all keep focusing on the emotional part of this, but this is supposed to be a horror story, and I'm getting like zero indication at this point of like what kind of horror is it? Like,
Mm,
is the wife going to come back and haunt them, or is a sea monster going to come out? Like, what are we dealing with? Like, what are the stakes of this horror? Um, and I would like some sort of, even if you don't want to introduce it quite yet,
yeah.
some sort of like grounding of like, okay, well, what kind of horror is this? Because we don't have that here.
We don't have that yet.
And when we were all discussing it, none of us thought even mentioned it. So it's like it just like glosses right past you.
What flavor is it? We don't know
Right.
yet.
I
Yeah.
need to know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Really good point. Our next entry is a weird fiction novel called The Higher Ups. We are Low City. The city, its buildings, and the creatures inside and out of the buildings are us. We are one of the old cities, crouching on the ruins of our predecessors. Beneath our surface, older layers gather and condense into a hard dust. Yet we were not always so conscious of ourselves. This is the story of how we were born. On a day not long ago, wintry silence held sway over Low City. Only a few bundled up pedestrians dared venture onto iced over streets. Among them strolled a young man named Kai. The part of us known as Kai had never lived anywhere else. He drifted, more like a wind-blown leaf than any sort of animal life, and was soothed by the accumulation of doors and alleys, gray-branched bushes and trees, signs, faces, and shuffling feet. The borders of his self softened and blended with the city. The reverie was interrupted by playing children. "I'm the figure keeper," shouted a girl. "Let me count. 1, 2, 8. You have 8 toes." "No," answered a younger boy, perhaps her brother. He ran and she chased. Kai, glimmering between childhood and adulthood, suppressed the urge to join them. He walked on through dingy snowdrifts, enjoying the crunch like soft bones underfoot. Kai turned down a main thoroughfare, too broad for the sparse foot traffic it accommodated these days. Still, you had to be careful. Ancient automated taxis roamed the streets, but by some glitch, they no longer ever stopped. Another entry, no hands raised. Interesting. Lesley.
So if knowing that this is a novel, um, I would definitely keep reading from here because I feel like right at the end we got some really interesting kind of details that made my little brain go, "Ooh, okay, I want to see where this goes." Um, I really liked the description of crunch like soft bones. I thought that was a really nice description. And then that idea right at the end that you have these roaming automated taxis that don't stop. That is a really great detail. Like that, I'll be honest, like that was the detail that made me go, yep, I would keep reading. Because the beginning, this this idea of like we are the city and we're like not just the city, but also like the buildings and all of the creatures that inhabit the city. That is going to be a difficult concept to make come across in a believable way, right? And honestly, I'm not sure how you're going to do it for where it feels cohesive. Because like you're telling us, okay, well, we're going to tell you how we become we, and then you start describing Kai, and the whole concept of we, obviously it's supposed to not be there because this is how you become we, but I would be very interested to see how you make this idea of everything within this city is this one collective we. It would be very interesting to see how you get there in a way that feels cohesive. But when I got to that automated taxis part, I was like, yep, I would keep reading because I want to know like what kind of city that we're in where you've got taxis that just are roaming and not stopping, but kids are also playing in the streets. Like that seems like a bold choice for parents. Go play in the streets where the automated taxis might.
Don't get hit. Yeah.
Don't get hit. So I would definitely keep reading. If this was a short story, I would be at this point having a hard time thinking you'd be able to wrap it up in a way that felt cohesive and believable. But with a novel, you have the space to really get your readers to buy in. And so I think that it can be done. I would be interested to see how it's done in a way that's believable because it's a very hard concept. Like when you're thinking about it, you're like, how do I make the reader buy in that everything is part of one
this consciousness.
collective consciousness?
Interesting. Yeah. Becky?
I love the language in this. I was really invested in the we, and so then the shift to this almost omniscient. If it was a short story, I probably would have been a lot more skeptical about that shift, starting with the we and then dropping into this like top-down kind of omniscient on Kai. But in a novel, that kind of storytelling distance can work. In a novel, I'm almost concerned that we aren't in the we long enough for the reader to really be invested in that before we drop it, before we kind of shift into a more omniscient storytelling. And so that was an interesting choice with the plural going into that. That being said, I was interested by like some of the small details here, like 8 toes. That's an interesting little detail. Like I was saying earlier, it kind of disturbs what the reader might be expecting just at like the subconscious level. So that makes me lean forward a little bit. Like Lesley said, Kai enjoying the crunch like soft bones. That sounds like it's in his POV, that he is specifically enjoying the fact that this feels like soft bones crunching. And that makes me really curious what Kai's life experiences are, that he knows what that feels like and enjoys that. And so that makes me care about the character. I agree that the automated taxis not stopping is a really interesting comment. As an opening paragraph, I don't get a strong sense of any kind of emotional thread here. And that would make me kind of wonder what I'm supposed to latch onto as a reader. Which part of these beautiful specific descriptions is important and which are just vibes? And like, are the taxis important, or is that just to like show that it's dangerous to walk in the streets and we're never going to see them again? So without probably a sense of interiority, which is hard from this POV, I don't know. I would keep reading and I like it, but I definitely have questions.
Definitely. Definitely questions. Sloane.
Yeah, I thought this was really interesting. For a weird fiction novel, I feel like the thesis is so clearly presented right out of the gate that uh it felt a little um almost like clinical the way they presented this concept. But I do like it. I think it's very interesting how like bluntly it's delivered. Um, there's some interesting things going on here with the omniscient POV that maybe need to be looked at. For example, like the borders of a self softened and blended with the city. From the POV of this character, from the city character, who is all these people, what is that saying? And do we need to have a more defined presentation that this is Kai's feelings and Kai doesn't feel like part of the city? Or is this like a mutual oneness that everyone is aware of? That's what I would
Mm-hmm.
be interested in. There's also like the little boy and girl. It says like, no, answered the younger boy, perhaps her brother. Perhaps this character is all these characters, so it would know if it's the brother or a friend. So probably just little details like that to clear up. Like you're working with this very grand perspective, so making sure that all these little details are falling into line is probably going to be important to maintain that cohesive, omniscient presence. Um, and yeah, I agree. Also, I think it was Rebecca that said there's no emotional thread presented here. So I did feel quite distant. It feels very much like I'm being presented kind of like a folk tale or like maybe some
Mm,
sort of like something that's like not necessarily about like the emotions in the story, but is presenting like a chronology, a history of something. So I would hope there would be more just emotional depth as we move forward with this Kai character. But I think it's interesting. I would be curious to read a little bit more.
yeah, I think that's exactly where I was, Sloane, is the why are we telling it this way? What are we telling? And then who is it for? Is it for parts of the city itself that like the consciousness is trying to share this history, this chronology, like you said, with a piece of itself that's new? Or is it, yeah, I'm wondering who they are, who we are, why, all of that. But there's some really interesting ideas that seem to be literally in the next paragraph potentially.
And I think that it could be very, very easy for both the author and the reader to kind of lose the thread of we is everything. You know what I'm saying? It would be
Yeah.
very, very easy as a reader to kind of like forget that fact. And then if it's like pushed into the narrative in a way that's kind of jarring, they're going to be like, oh, like it could be a jarring experience. So it is like I think that this is a really interesting writing experiment. Um, I just think that it will be difficult to one hold that because it is a really
For
hard
a novel.
perspective.
Yeah.
And two, to hold it in such a way that one, you're not kind of pushing your reader away because obviously the reader is not part of we, but at the same time, you don't let the reader get so comfortable in that they forget that we is everything. So
Hmm.
it's like a balancing act almost.
Mm-hmm.
I think that could be really interesting too, having this omniscient narrator who is like both simultaneously observing outside, but also in these creatures, these characters. You could present so many minute, interesting details
Mm.
just out of the blue, like ex extremely specific details and thoughts and interiority. Um, so that could be something to play with as well. Like how deeply does the city understand these characters and what does it want to present to us and why?
Yeah, very interesting questions. Interesting concept. Our next entry is a horror novel. Current title is The 12 Apostles. I've done this 99 times. Current afflicted member of the faithful, my 100th. I feel like I should get him balloons if we succeed, or maybe just breakfast at the diner down the road. He's tied, with a rosary, to a folding chair made from wood of an old church pew. We're both breathing hard, sweating. I'm leaving greasy fingerprints in my Bible, flipped back to the rite of exorcism. The binding is cracked there for my first time when the guy knocked it out of my hand. It was before I started tying them. I straddle him and lean my face in close to his. A risk, but one that's paid off before. What's your name? I purr, my hand in his torn open shirt. I avoid the burn left by my crucifix from Jerusalem. He's trembling beneath me, his eyes darting this way and that. Martin, you know that. What's your name? I nuzzle his neck just beneath the ear, despite the sour panic sweat. He is rigid between my thighs. I try not to think of what Big John would think of this approach, or my dad. Martin, why are you asking me my name? What's your name? He stiffens, and I sit back on his knees as his eyes roll back and a slow, bestial growl ripples up his throat. Barbus. He cocks his head slowly and too far to the side. You're no priest. You're a woman. Will you leave now of your own volition? No hands up? Did I miss anyone? No hands up? Okay. Sloane.
Oh, a spicy one. That's fun. Um, yeah, this is a real hard-hitting opener for a horror novel. This is pretty cool. Very sexy. I like the character's voice that we're getting. It's very like kind of like a bit grizzled. This character has clearly gone through this a lot of times and has their own technique for dealing with exorcisms and demons. And it's hot. And yeah, it's pretty cool. I like this.
Awesome. Rebecca?
I like a lot about this. So I'm not going to repeat. I liked all the things that Sloane was talking about, so I'm not going to repeat all that. I will say that the first sentence is difficult to parse, and that's risky in an industry where editors and agents have to make decisions very quickly sometimes. You don't want to stumble right in that first sentence. So I might interrogate that sentence a little bit because for me, it was a little bit hard to understand. Once we got into the next sentence, which is really, really good, the balloons and breakfast at the diner, absolutely amazing because it feeds into that whole sexual overtone that comes later in the excerpt. Love that. Um, and I love the greasy fingerprints, but I'm pretty sure that that exorcism is not in the Bible. It's a Catholic rite, and so it's an extra textual thing. I don't think it's actually biblical, and so that kind of threw me out because I was like, "Wait, do I have that wrong?"
Mm.
And so that kind of, especially in a book about somebody exorcising a demon, making sure that you have your details and your research right is really, really important. Um, because if you get a reader who understands differently, that's going to throw them completely out of immersion, and you're going to lose trust with your readers. um that being said, I love Big John. Like, I want to know who Big John is. I want to know how Big John goes about seducing and exercising his feet. I love this whole thing. But yeah, be careful about your research, and that first sentence could probably use a little bit of interrogation.
Interrogate your sentences. You heard it here first. Lesley, what do you think?
I have to say I am waffling wildly between I love that we're getting a flippant exorcism story and feeling like, but is that like is it horror? Like this reads the beginning of this. If you had said this is urban fantasy, I would have been like, yes,
sure, yeah,
flippant exorcist, like exorcism. Yes, let's do this, because then you've got this person who is just like, I've done this 100 times and I am tired of doing this, and I am going to use whatever means necessary. I think it's a harder sell if you're trying to be like, no, this is straight horror. Because the tone makes it not scary.
mm-hmm.
So I guess you really need to kind of like criticize, like, what is my intent with this novel? Is it like a straight horror? Then your tone may not be appropriate. But if it's not a straight horror, and if you're leaning more into that urban fantasy or comedy horror, which I love, like, I'm not saying I don't love it, but it's one of those things where you're setting up, readers' expectations are set by so many different things. And so it's like, I see horror and I see 12 apostles, like, as the title, and there is a lot of really great religious horror that kind of becomes this like backbone of your expectations, and this tone doesn't fit that. So I would question whether or not I want to be like, yes, this is solidly horror. I would also question, like, if it's not solidly horror, then maybe think of a title that kind of represents the tone that you're going for, that like keys in that this is like, has religious undertones, but it's also this very sarcastic, like, no nonsense, I will use seduction to beat out the devil kind of thing. Also, I have to just point out that I'm like, really love when he says Barbas and then you use that he cocks his head. I was like, I see what you did there and I like it. So yeah, I would just really question whether you're willing to fight the expectations that horror readers have when you say this is horror and it's a religious horror, and then kind of shaking those expectations with the tone. If you're okay with fighting those, and you're willing to bet that you can get the readers to buy into it, run with it. Otherwise, you might want to be like, oh, okay, it's dark fantasy, it's urban fantasy, and maybe tip people off in your title that it's not going to be the same overly atmospheric and like intense dark, like, those movies where it's like, did you see something in the shadows? Is that shadow slightly darker? Like that intense claustrophobic feel that you get in a lot of religious horror. Like, maybe do something to tip your reader off ahead of time that that's not what this is, just so that they're not starting it and going, wait, like, I feel like I have whiplash because I was expecting one thing and this is tonally completely different. But I did absolutely love everything that I read. It was just that mental whiplash of like, oh, okay, 12 Apostles horror immediately sets expectations up.
Absolutely. And I think, just as a note, that's one of the reasons why we set up Snap Judgment in the way that we do, right? Where we get the title, what kind of piece is it? Is it short? Is it a novella? Is it a novel? And what genre that the author would like to identify it as, because that can help shorthand the reader's involvement and buy-in, right? If I picked this up and I knew it was a horror novel, I might not read the first page. I might pick it up and go, "Oh, that's not my genre, that's not my bag." But if I had read this and then found out that it was a horror novel, I probably would have bought it. Like, because that was my reaction as a reader, right? So be aware, like Lesley said, of how you're identifying the tone that you're going to be using and what kind of buy-in you're asking from the reader. That's cool.
Well, and I mean, it's totally okay to go against what you are aware society's expectations of a certain type of trope or genre, what it is. That is completely okay to do that. But you have to, you're really gambling on whether or not you can flip those expectations fast enough that you get the reader buy-in. Because if as a horror reader, if I was going, oh, I really want to read a religious horror novel, and I picked this up, this would not, like, that wouldn't fulfill that itch that I was having. But if I was looking for a flippant, more dark fantasy, urban fantasy that has religious overtones, this absolutely would be what I want. So you just have to, like, decide whether you're willing to gamble that you can hook people fast enough that they're willing to buck the expectations of what they thought they were getting.
Absolutely. Our next entry is a horror/dark fantasy short story called What the Peat Bog Keeps. A tall and slouching figure draped in sodden robes ambles through the mirelands of Skiljawid. Foreboding calls of swamp grouse issue forth as if in warning, but they dissuade him not from his search. His self-forced march proceeds at plodding pace. He carries his boots in hand, lest the sucking, spongy landscape swallows them. Where tufts of grass are intertwined with rivulets of swampish black, he stops. Eyes, then feet, both follow these to a murky pool. There he pauses not before scooping up a clod of peat, and yes, with bare hands, for he must feel the bog to know its nature. He rolls the peat clod in his hands. Its black muck clings to them, its fetid moisture seeps into his pores. The scent exudes pungency, overpowers the aroma of ancient moss. This bog may indeed preserve what he seeks. To know what the bog holds, he tastes its slickness. At the fore are tannins, prehistoric, bitter as remorse. Beneath, the faint sweetness of stalled decay. But after testing, he finds the sign long he has sought. Undertones of rancid oil. The time has come. He works his spellcraft. Two reagents form the sympathetic link. A hempen garrote that he can feel its grain against his neck, an extract of hemlock for him to imbibe. A cautious dosage, not enough to end his life. But his muscles tingle, his breathing strains with effort. By way of ritual, he knows the final torments of the one who lies below. No hands up. Impeccable. Sloane.
This was very beautifully written. I think I was getting a little bit lost in the language a little bit. But overall, it has my curiosity. I would keep reading. Possibly I would like a little bit of speeding up, because this felt very drawn out, and I think it was the language, kind of extending this like walk through the bog. Um, but I think it did such a good job setting up the tone and the like physicality of this bog that I don't think we need a lot of like repetition there. And I felt a lot of repetition in the description. But overall, I think this was pretty solid. I'm curious about what this character is looking for. And yeah, I will keep reading.
Awesome. Thank you, Sloane. Rebecca?
Uh, Again, I like the language a great deal here. Um, that being said, the kind of antiquated phrasing of like dissuade him not from his search. He finds a sign he long has sought. Um, I stumbled at one point trying to get that out. And it can work. We've all, there's books out there with all sorts of language in it, and that can be really good. But it can also make the reader stumble or slow because they want to make sure that they're getting it right. And if that's your intention, then like Sloane was saying, this reads very slow, but it can get grueling or like you're making the reader do work. Um, that being said, I really like the sensory experience of this. Um, it felt very intentional, so I trusted that was part of the experience that the author wanted me to have, as opposed to it feeling like somebody just describing everything because they don't know what else to do. It felt very on purpose. Um, and I was really all in when he works his spellcraft. I felt like I wanted to know why or what the purpose or goal, even if it's approximate goal. Again, it doesn't have to be like the story level goal, but to be invested in the outcome of some kind of spellcraft, I would want to know what the goal or the hope or the motivation or the emotion tied to it is. Like it was just a little bit dislocated for me. That being said, I would absolutely keep reading because the language here is really, really yummy.
Yeah. Lesley?
I agree. This is beautifully written. I loved that detail of him carrying the boots so that they don't get sucked up. Like I thought that was a really great detail to add in there, because immediately your reader's going to know exactly what that means and how that feels. So I thought that was a really, really good detail. I am a little bit like wondering when and if we're going to be introduced to other characters, um because we're in the middle of the bog, and it's like, are there other characters for this character to play off of? Because if there are not, I do feel this would get very tedious, because it is so kind of drawn out and slow. So you would run the risk of your reader losing that investment in this story, and losing, like, beautiful language can only hold attention for so long before your reader's like, this is a lot of work with
Mm.
no like payout. And so I am a little bit curious. I'm very curious actually to see where it is headed. It could be something really, really amazing, and this long drawn out intro is totally worth it. Like, you feel that was a good investment, but it would be very easy to be like, oh, okay, like it just kept the same tone. So it could go either way. Like, we don't have enough here for me to be able to say one way or the other whether I feel like it has a purpose, and that's what I think we need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Sloane?
Sloane already went. I went, but yeah, I
Did
agree.
everyone go? I was counting and then I got lost. Did everyone go?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna say too that I agree that some of this phrasing is so beautiful, but it, like you were saying, I think we all kind of touched on, like, it can feel slow, it can feel a little burdensome for the reader to get through. Um, I love getting to read these out loud for Snap Judgment too, because it gives you a chance to hear what someone who's not you sounds like when they're reading it out loud. And that can feel completely different than your intention too. So that's always good to have someone else read your work out loud to feel what that feels like. I would hope too that, because I also want to know, I want to know what the ritual is. I want to know what's going to happen and why is this so important. But I would hope that the pace would immediately pick up now that a ritual is in place and the magic is happening. I would hope that the language would reflect the speed and the heightened moment of that following this moment. But it is a really interesting piece of description here. I I'm going to be real with you all. I do not think we have it in us to speed through the next entry. I don't think that that's a wise idea, so I'm not going to make us do it. But I do want to say that the entries for this particular snap judgment were so incredible. And as we said at the beginning, these were randomized. So they were in a random order. And if we didn't get to your piece, we apologize and we thank you for submitting it. And we thank you to the authors that we did get to for being brave enough and kind enough to share your work with us in this way for this feedback. And we hope very much that it was useful to you in some way, shape, or form. Thank you to everybody who was able to tune in this time. And if you're watching on the replay, thank you for watching it after the fact. You are also important to us, and we thank you. Thank you to our wonderful panel of editors and judges, Lesley, Rebecca, and Sloane, especially Sloane, able to join us as our wonderful guest. We really appreciate your insights today, so thank you. If you enjoyed what you saw and heard here today, please check out Sloane's work in Death in the Mouth Volume 2, the illustrated BIPOC BIPOC horror anthology that Sloane co-edited with Cassie Hart. You can pick up a copy online at sloane.bigcartel.com. Sloane, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This was super fun. And yeah, like you said, amazing entries. These are all like pretty awesome, and I hope the writers are excited about the feedback they got, because overall I think these are all very just cool, interesting stories, and I hope I can read them in full someday.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I definitely think it's worth noting that so many of these, no one had their hands raised, and we all had a lot of thoughts to share about them. So I think that's really good sign. Thank you, Sloane. If you found the judges' comments helpful and you're hungry for more insights into the writing of short fiction pieces, there are still seats available for Rebecca Treasure's popular Keep It Short Writing Flash Fiction live workshop at reachyourapex.com. That's crazy. What that's really cool. The links are in the show notes apparently. I love that. That's great. Thank you for being here, Rebecca.
Thank you as always. It's always a fun and educational experience to come and listen to the other judges and everybody. And thank you to the very courageous writers who submitted.
Absolutely. And thank you, Lesley, for joining us and for being a part of the discourse here today as well.
Thanks. I'm like, keep it short.
She's already said everything she needed to say. That's it. Be sure to visit us online at apex-magazine.com. Follow us on Blue Sky at apexmag.bsky.social. This also should be in the show notes, so check that out. I, as ever, am your host and narrator, Allie Grauer. You can find me on dreamstobecome.bsky.social, and mostly on Instagram these days, I'll be honest, but we all know how that's like, at Dreams to Become. I look forward to the next Snap Judgment. Thank you to our judges and editors. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to the writers. Keep writing, keep exploring, keep being brave, beautiful, shocking, surreal. We have a motto. What is it? What's the motto? It's strange, surreal, shocking, beautiful.
Yeah,
Surreal,
there you go.
strange, shocking, beautiful, surreal. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for tuning in.